Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Last time, we talked about Henry Every and the Fancy meandering around the southeast coast of Africa. They sailed from the Cape of Good Hope to St. Augustine Bay, alias Libertalia, to the Comoros Islands, back to Libertalia, and then back to the Cape. It wasn't all aimless wandering, though. Captain Every was actively searching for ships that might join him and aid in his plans. Now, Henry Every didn't know that anybody was coming. He had sent that open letter out to English sea captains, a letter informing them of his intentions and promising not to attack them. But all he had was that letter and hope that someone might show up. Because, well, Henry Every had a very fine ship and a large crew and a lot of guns, but they still weren't enough for what he had planned. He needed allies, and if anyone out there had put the pieces together, had calculated what he did have planned, they would come. But Henry Every's best hope was the one pirate who had done this all before, Thomas Tew. Luckily for Every and the crew of the Fancy, Thomas Tew and his friends were coming. This is episode 217, Bob's Key. After their very close call with the Mocha frigate off the coast of South Africa, the Fancy ran, and she ran hard. That's a tricky bit of sailing, too. To get away from a ship that's coming in from the east, the Fancy would have had to sail west and then south. That's not difficult. That's the way the wind would have been pushing them anyway. But then you have to catch the currents that will turn you around. This type of current is called a retroflexion. It's caused by wind patterns and the shape of the sea floor. And the retroflexion southwest of South Africa, well, it's a ship killer. A lot of storms are born there, a ton of hurricanes, and even just catching the waves could be deadly in the age of sail even today. But Fancy was up to the task, as were her sailors. Henry Every and his men made it out safely, and they caught the winds heading back west. They probably stopped once again at St. Augustine Bay, and when no news of any other ships were found, finally they sailed on to the Gate of Tears. A few episodes back, we discussed the Hajj, the yearly pilgrimage to Mecca that Muslims are expected to undertake once in their lifetimes. This event takes place in, and please excuse my Arabic here, but it takes place in the month of Dhu al-Hijjah, the month of the Hajj, and it's the month that marks the end of the Islamic year. But here's the catch. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar. That means that, when compared to a solar calendar, like we use in the West, their years are going to be shorter by about 11 or 12 days. And it also means that their months don't line up with the seasons, like solar calendars do. Instead, their months kind of migrate through the seasons year to year. If Henry Every did indeed spend his early naval career under Admiral John Narborough and John Benbow on the Barbary Coast, he may have been familiar with the Islamic calendar. I suspect that he was at least passingly familiar with the Hajj because he was here at the Gate of Tears at this time of year for a very specific reason. And his window of opportunity was limited. His aim was to capture a fleet of almost unbelievably richly laden ships. They would be traveling from Mughal, India, into the Gulf of Aden, and then pass through the strait known as the Gate of Tears. That's where Henry Every intended to intercept them. Then, assuming that the pirates did not intercept them, they would move up the Red Sea to Jeddah, where they would land and make their way overland to Mecca. Now, we're going to talk more about the ships who did make this voyage next time. For now, we should be aware that they were filled with mountains of coined silver and gold, filled with rubies and emeralds and silks and indigo and dyes and spices and anything that the pilgrims or those who were sailing along with the pilgrims might need to trade once they reached Arabia. They were the equivalent of the Spanish treasure fleets. Henry Every missed his first window of opportunity. He'd arrived in time to the region to catch the ships as they sailed toward Mecca, but he was alone when he arrived. He might have caught a lone straggler if she was a weak ship, but he wouldn't have been able to capture the kind of prize he wanted. So Henry Every took a calculated risk. Instead of continuing on, as we discussed last time, he spent those weeks sailing around looking for other pirates. But he failed to find any. And the window on his second opportunity was closing. Those ships, after their journey to Mecca, would be traveling back down the Red Sea. They would be filled with the proceeds of their trade, perhaps even more richly laden than they had been. And Fancy could make it to the Gulf of Aden and the Strait at the Gate of Tears in time, but he would be alone, and he would have to moderate his piratical designs. But Henry Every wasn't going to come all this way for nothing, so that's what he did. He sailed to the entrance to the Red Sea, and he waited. In the meantime, all of these other pirates that have been making their way toward Africa finally arrived on the scene. They were actually close to Henry Every when he arrived at Johanna in South Africa, but they'd taken a wide berth around the Dutch waters of South Africa. They were too far out to sea. Henry Every never heard even a whisper of their presence. But probably just a few days after Henry Every left Libertalia, Thomas Tew's Amity arrived alongside the Portsmouth Adventure under Captain Joseph Farrow and the Dolphin under Captain Richard Want. This was probably sometime early to mid-May 1695. Now, when I picture Henry Every, I picture a big guy. Not hugely tall necessarily, but broad shoulders and big arms and stout legs and a gruff, bearded, weather-beaten face, a stout man. And I picture him in a blue navyman's coat. These were standard-issue coats from the inception of the Royal Navy, but only for commissioned officers. Still, Henry Every did have one at one point. I don't know that he had one in 1695, but it's how I picture him. But you know the kind of coat I'm talking about. A blue, knee-length, double-breasted coat so that it could be buttoned up to protect against inclement weather or opened up and tied back for hot tropical seas. And it's got those really big cuffs at the end that could be rolled up and tied down at the shoulder for hot weather or for dirty work. It's the uniform of a Royal Navy officer for the 17th and 18th centuries. And it will be the uniform for more than a few pirates. Henry Every may even have had a tricorn hat. Now, don't picture a leather hat. Jack Sparrow's pretty cool hat aside, the Royal Navy issued broad-brimmed wool hats to their sailors. The style in the English armed forces up until about this period was to pin up this hat on one side, usually the right side, where you would carry your musket while you were marching. But in the 9 Years' War, the English picked up the Spanish style of the tricorn. And Henry Every may even have owned a pair of tall leather boots turned down at the knee. Traditionally, these were cavalrymen's attire. But once the cavalry began to diminish in worth, they became fashionable for naval officers. But even if he did own a pair of boots like that, he wouldn't have worn them aboard. No one wore those boots on board unless he was an especially vain captain of a capital ship. James Stewart, for example, did occasionally wear those high boots while aboard, but never when they were in battle or in rough weather. They're poor footwear for real work on a ship. On the other hand, I picture Thomas Tew as less broad. Kind of slender, maybe taller than Henry Every, and certainly not dressed in Royal Navy attire. While Henry Every certainly had a rough face, probably scarred from battle, Thomas Tew was, well, I picture him as handsome. My image of Thomas Tew is certainly informed by Howard Pyle's drawing of the pirate enjoying a pipe with Benjamin Fletcher in his mansion. And that image is a bit, mischievous. Not exactly Han Solo levels of dashing, but still a good-looking rogue. I picture him with long hair pulled back and maybe even an earring. So here we have this tall, slim, dashing rogue in his late 30s or early 40s, and I'd like you to remember here that Thomas Tew was married. He had a wife and a couple of kids back in New York in his estate there. Now, there isn't a whole lot of information about his wife, but she was a society hostess in New York. She rubbed elbows with the families of men like Captain Kidd and even Governor Fletcher. And I bring her and his family up because Thomas Tew is about to be unfaithful. But he's going to do so with no less a personage than a queen. When the Amity arrived at Libertalia, Thomas Tew caught the eye of none other than Queen Antavaratra Rahina, the queen of the Betsimi Soraka Confederation. And I should say allegedly. Here, we don't have Thomas Tew's account of his time at Libertalia. We don't even have the queen's. It might all be myth or later propaganda. But it's certainly possible that this handsome, dashing pirate captain with a fleet of ships and a couple hundred well-armed men, well, he might just catch the interest of the queen. See, Queen Rahina was young, and as yet unmarried and uncertain in her power. And a man like Thomas Tew might make a powerful ally for her reign. And who knows, maybe Thomas Tew was considering her offer. New York was cold and stuffy. Out here at Madagascar was warm. They had fresh air and fresh fruit and a beautiful young queen who wanted to make him her lover and concubine. Thomas Tew could have made himself a true pirate king of a real pirate kingdom. Maybe here he even decided to call it Libertalia. Regardless, Queen Rahina, according to the story, did take Thomas Tew to bed, probably for his whole stay at St. Augustine Bay. And I picture the queen traveling through town and down to the pirate camp on the shore, likely being carried on a palanquin, with her lover Thomas Tew at her side. And Thomas Tew did stay and enjoy her charms for some time, but he did have places to be. His men were growing restless while their captain spent his days entertaining the queen. Amity was already ready to sail. The other two ships in his fleet, Portsmouth Adventure and Dolphin, well, they left Thomas Tew there. They sailed north without him. So Thomas Tew did eventually untangle himself from the queen's embrace and prepared to depart. When his men were just about to get the Amity underway, two ships approached from the southwest. And it's moments like this that I really would kill to have a really good source for. We can only speculate on what went through their heads here. Thomas Tew may have seen those ships before, but probably they were strangers to him. Clearly not East India Company vessels, nor Royal Navy vessels, and not Dutch. But they were well armed, and England was at war. If they were French ships, they were in for a fight here at St. Augustine Bay. And the French did have a presence in the region. Reunion Island, over to the east, was actually Réunion. So I imagine that Amity prepared herself. They could run. Maybe they could outpace the newcomers. But then that would let the ship get away, and here, at anchor in St. Augustine Bay, they had men and guns and somewhere to run if they should be sunk. But they were in luck. As you may already have surmised, those two ships turned out to be Thomas Wake in the Susanna and William Mason in the Pearl. They had naturally heard about Tew's plans to sail for the Red Sea, to capture rich Moorish shipping. In fact, it was probably one of Tew's own men that had informed them. Thomas Wake and William Mason agreed to sail with him under Thomas Tew. This meant that Thomas Tew had 2 new ships following him, and there were 2 already on their way to the Red Sea, waiting for him. Thomas Tew was leading quite the pirate armada, and may have assumed himself in a position to be elected admiral once they reached the Gate of Tears. And now, a quick sidebar. When Thomas Tew left, Queen Rahina was pregnant. At least, according to the story. This story about Queen Rahina and Thomas Tew comes down to us from the Queen's son, Ratsimi-Hallo, allegedly fathered by Thomas Tew. Ratsimi-Hallo would be king one day. In about 20 years he would be king, which will correspond quite nicely with the dissolution of the Pirate Republic at Nassau, a time when, much like the late 1680s and early 1690s, pirates were fleeing from the West Indies to Madagascar. And an addendum to that sidebar, an addendum which has no relevance to our story today, but is worth note. A young boy named John Benbow Jr. and another young man named Edward Seagar were both 10 years old at this time. And then I'd like you to also remember Abraham Samuel, that Martinician slave turned pirate. He was on his way to Madagascar as well, aboard the John and Rebecca, one of those ships funded by Benjamin Fletcher to bring supplies to St. Mary's Island. Again, none of that is relevant today, but those pieces are all on the board, in motion, and are going to have a great impact on our story in the future. The Gate of Tears, the Bab al-Mandab Strait, separates the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden from the Red Sea. It was known by the pirates, according to E.T. Fox, as the Babs. The strait is only about 20 miles wide. That's 32 kilometers for our friends everywhere else in the world, and to the pirates about 7 leagues. There's this peninsula, a tiny little peninsula that sticks out into the sea, and about 2 miles off the coast of that peninsula lies an island, called Perim Island today, but the pirates called it Bob's Key, from the Bab el-Mandab to the Babs to Bob's Key. Now, the water between Arabia and Bob's Key is deep enough that most ships chose to hug the coast of the Arabian Peninsula when traveling up the Red Sea. They would travel through that 2-mile strait between the mainland and that island. On the other side of Bob's Key, you have about 16 miles between the island and mainland Africa, which at the time would have been the Kingdom of Ethiopia. But those 16 miles were not all available for large shipping. There's an archipelago of 7 tiny islands called the Seven Brothers that create a number of shifting and sandy bottoms that make it a treacherous piece of sailing. Most bigger ships couldn't even make it through. Large shipping, such as that as would be on their way to Mecca, had about 2 miles on one side of Bob's Key and maybe 7 or 8 on the other side. You can see why the Gate of Tears is one of the oldest and most lucrative hunting grounds for pirates in the history of the world. Henry Every and the Fancy waited for a time at Bob's Key, but then moved over to the Seven Brothers. There were a number of coves there that offered good places to hide, and you could keep an eye on the sea, both the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Near the end of May, 1695, Henry Every had a man up in the crow's nest, and he was armed with one of those looking glasses, still kind of a newfangled invention, but the Charles II had been graced with several. That lookout spotted 2 ships approaching from the south. As they got closer, they spotted English colors, and Every ordered the crew to set sail. The Fancy moved out into open water through which any ship had to pass, and then she waited. The 2 ships on the approach tightened their ranks, and they made to sail on either side of the Fancy. She was an impressive frigate, but if they had to fight, that would be their best tactical position. As soon as they were within range, but not within shouting distance, those 2 ships pulled up and aimed their guns at Fancy. But they didn't fire. Every, knowingly putting himself at a disadvantage, opened up his own sails and moved toward them. This was Every staying true to his word. Even at a disadvantage, he probably would have won that fight in the Fancy, but he didn't open fire. He said in that open letter to every English ship captain that he would not attack those flying English colors. Now, of course, he'd broken that word before, but here he didn't. One of the smaller craft hailed the frigate. They said, "From whence are ye come?" Every replied, "From the sea," and received the same answer back. Those 2 newcomers were, naturally, Richard Once Dolphin and Joseph Farrow's Portsmouth Adventure. Now, Henry Every didn't know these men or their ships. He had no way to, which is something kind of new to the world of the pirates. I mean, not entirely. Back in the West Indies, new pirate ships were arriving on the scene all the time, but during the buccaneering era, there was a community there. If you knew people in Tortuga or Port Royal, you had some connections, and ships would often meet that didn't know each other at all, complete strangers, but they had friends in common. Henry Every and the Fancy were English, though. These 2 new ships were American. But it's not like Fancy was going to turn them away. I mean, he'd been waiting for this moment for weeks, hoping that any ships would show up to join him. Even if they were small, that didn't matter much. They were nimble, they were quick, and they had guns on them. They wouldn't be able to capture any really big game on their own, but what they would do, and their purpose on the naval battlefield, was to keep the attention of the enemy crew divided. If they came upon a prize, Henry Every and the Fancy would engage and stand toe-to-toe with her, ship-of-the-line style, but on the other side of the craft, the smaller vessels would be darting around, taking shots and occasionally hitting some, and they would be, more importantly, drawing fire. Gunmen aboard those ships would have to divert their attention away from the Fancy to at least try to prevent being hit by one of those smaller craft. They may have had fewer guns, but they were the same size. They could tear down a mast just as easily. While the bigger craft, the Fancy, would be able to focus all of her guns on the prize vessel and eventually get in close and board her. Now, we don't have any account of this meeting here at the Babs, but likely the officers from the Dolphin and the Portsmouth Adventure went aboard the Fancy and had a council. Talked about who they were, why they were there, and likely mentioned the fact that Thomas too was on his way. We do know, though, that these 2 ships agreed here to follow Henry Every. Since Thomas too was too busy with his queen to have joined them, they elected Henry Every as admiral. But of course they did. Even if we were to take Henry Every himself out of the equation, whoever captained the Fancy would be the obvious choice to be in charge. It was one of the finest ships that any men there had ever seen. It was probably a better ship than anyone on board the Dolphin or the Portsmouth Adventure had ever sailed on. Beyond that, just the logistics. It's the tallest ship in their fleet. It's going to hand out orders as the flagship. And just the size and power and speed of that vessel means that it will dictate strategy in any naval fight. But of course, Henry Every himself, regardless of the Fancy, was still the obvious choice. Even if they all sailed on relatively equal ships, his experience in the Royal Navy, in maybe as many as dozens of battles, makes him the only real choice to serve as admiral. So the captains and the quartermasters all agreed and toasted their new venture. That night, the fleet there, at the Gate of Tears, was hit by a terrible storm, a storm that scattered them all into the Gulf of Aden. All 3 ships lost sight of the others, and it was a hard storm. The Portsmouth Adventure and the Dolphin rode out the storm well enough, but Fancy was damaged pretty badly. She lost her mainmast in the wind. Now, they had the tools and the materials to repair her, but it would take time. Time that they maybe did not have to lose. So the crew set to repairing her as fast as they were able. Luckily, the following day Captain Want found the Fancy, and then a day later the Dolphin did as well. Captain Farrow, though, of the Dolphin had word of 3 ships that were approaching from the south. They were following him. He must have known, or at the very least suspected who they were. Still, he ran back to the Fancy just in case. The men of the Fancy redoubled their repair efforts and got their mast up and running as soon as possible, just in case. But beyond that, even if they weren't enemy combatants, if they were who these pirates thought they were, well, first impressions are important. You don't want a man like Thomas Tew to see you, the very first time he meets you, with your mast down around your ankles. And of course it was Thomas Tew. At the end of May, or perhaps in early June, 1695, Thomas Tew arrived at Bob's Key, alongside Captains Mason and Wake, to join in this pirate armada. And there was actually another pirate crew with them. There was a French brigantine full of French pirates that had been damaged in that same storm so badly that their ship was sinking. Captain Mason arrived on the scene and rescued them. His ship was a bit crowded, though, so once they joined up with the Fancy and the others, that entire crew climbed aboard the Fancy. Now that they were all assembled and nobody had word of any new ships maybe arriving on the scene, all of the captains and their quartermasters and any of the, influential officers, say the representatives of that French crew or that other French crew, all of those climbed aboard the Fancy to hold a pirate council. We do not, to my great sorrow, have a copy of the code to which they all agreed. We know that they had one, but only 2 pieces of information survive about that pirate code. First, all of those assembled officers voted in Henry Every as the admiral. This time, though, with the entire fleet assembled, there might have been a bit of drama surrounding Henry Every and Thomas Tew. At least, I'm sure Tew put his name into the hat. The vote was maybe even kind of close, but we don't know. We do know that Henry Every, the obvious, really the only choice, was elected admiral. The other snippet of information is this. In a later testimony, some of Every's crew testified that the representatives of all the crews agreed, whatever the circumstances surrounding the capture of a prize, that they would, quote, share and share alike. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. Does it mean that every man in the fleet is going to get an equal share? Well, probably not. At least we know that Henry Every and the other captains got a larger share than the regular crewmen, which was traditional. It looks like what they were saying when they said share and share alike is that they were all of a piece. They were all one cohesive fleet. If one of the ships in the fleet was, say, damaged, or otherwise unable to participate in taking a ship, they would still get a share. I mean, naturally, cowardice would disqualify a ship. If they ran away, they get nothing. But if in good faith they tried and were unable to fight, they wouldn't be cut out of the winnings. With the pirate code adopted, Henry Every elected, and the fleet ready to capture the largest prize any of them had ever seen, the pirates set to having a party. And this was it. This was the most powerful pirate fleet that the world had seen in well over a decade, since at least the Second Pacific Adventure back in October of 1684, maybe longer. There were 6 ships: the 90-ton, 6-gun, 60-man brigantine Portsmouth Adventure under Joseph Farrow, the 100-ton, 6-gun, 60-man brigantine Dolphin under Richard Wundt, the 70-ton, 8-gun, 60-man sloop Amity under Thomas Tew, Thomas Wake's Susanna of 100 tons, 10 guns, and 70 men, William Mason in the 200-ton, 16-gun, 100-man frigate, the Pearl, and then finally leading them was Henry Every. The Charles II had been a frigate, but considering their renovations, the Fancy, a 46-gun, 170-man vessel, would better be classified as a man-of-war. They were assembled. They were ready for a little bit of crime. Now all they had to do was build their web and wait. I'd like to begin today by talking about birds. Last time we talked about how I picture Henry Every: the blue naval officer's coat, the tricorn hat, and probably a Navy-issue cutlass. Add to that the flintlock pistol he wore and the spyglass he carried, and you have an almost perfect image of a pirate. All you're missing are the disabilities due to injury that were so common among the pirates. A hook hand and an eye patch and a peg leg. But then there's one other thing. One common accessory, traditional to the pirates. A brightly plumed parrot perched on the pirate captain's shoulder. It's something you often see in drawings of pirates intended for kids. They'll have a bandana and a wooden sword and a parrot. But your more modern and mature and realistic depictions of pirates rarely have that parrot perched on their shoulder. It's, goofy, it's kid stuff. Except that it's not. The parrot perched on a pirate's shoulder was a very real phenomenon. The pirate teaching his parrot to speak was a very real phenomenon. See, parrots, but more broadly, exotic birds in general, were about to become very big business. By about the middle of the 18th century, there were fleets sent out exclusively to trap exotic birds. The stranger they were, or more beautiful they were, the better. But the early days of this trade, not the beginning of the trade, but right about the 1680s and 1690s, it was a trade often, not exclusively, but often executed by pirates. The European fascination with exotic, often tropical birds goes back to the Middle Ages. But this most recent craze in Europe can be traced back to 1684 and the court of King Louis XIV. There was this diplomatic embassy sent by the King of Siam, a kingdom that included parts of modern Thailand and Laos and Cambodia and even Vietnam, that really wowed the courts of both Louis XIV and Charles II. They wore strange clothes, they wore strange perfumes, they kowtowed to Louis XIV. Literally, it was a practice in Siam that was unknown in Europe and the origin of that word in English. But beyond that, they brought all manner of goods from Southeast Asia and a number of exotic wild animals. This embassy to France, sent by the King of Siam, would have massive consequences in global colonial geopolitics for centuries to come, but for our purposes, the most notable result immediately was the mania that gripped the rich and powerful of Europe in a fever for their exotic birds. If you picture a lavish, noble estate in Europe, there's almost certainly going to be a few wild and certainly not native birds wandering around flashing their brilliant plumage. You'll also notice that flightless birds tend to be the most common in those estates. I suspect because they can't fly away, therefore they stay on your land, therefore they continue to be exclusive to the elite. The peacock was probably the most popular of these birds, but there were others. For example, there was what we call today the helmeted guinea fowl. They have this beautiful black and white spotted plumage, but to crown it, they have a bright blue head. The helmeted guinea fowl are also pretty large. A lot of meat on a guinea fowl. They in fact have been domesticated, and it wouldn't surprise me if a few of you out there have eaten guinea fowl. At the time, though, they weren't called the helmeted guinea fowl. They were called the turkey bird. Now, the helmeted guinea fowl comes originally from Africa. The most beautiful varieties originate in Madagascar. But they were imported to Europe via Turkey. And aside from their bright blue head, which is, pretty noticeable, but aside from that, they do look a bit like an American turkey, which is, of course, where the turkey, which some of us might enjoy at Thanksgiving, gets its name. But all of these exotic birds, the peacock and the helmeted guinea fowl, and naturally the parrot, those that could be taught to recite words were the most popular. They were all common sights on pirate ships. And why not? You make a landing, you have men out collecting wood and water. Why not send a party of trappers out to see if they can't find some exotic birds? When your ship finally does make it back to port with all of your pirated goods, you will be dealing with merchants who deal in spices and dyes and all manner of exotic goods. They have contacts among the rich and powerful. They're going to be able to sell your talking parrot, and they're going to be able to get a very good price for it. All of which is to say, when you picture Henry Every standing on the deck of the Fancy today, or Thomas too for that matter, or really any of the pirates, feel free to picture them feeding hardtack to a bright-plumaged parrot perched upon their shoulder. This is episode 218, Idleness. I should warn you that in today's episode, not a lot is going to happen. Don't worry, we have plenty to talk about, but as far as the narrative thrust of the episode goes, there's not much going on. Now, I could have skipped right to the exciting stuff, and I almost did, but I decided against it despite the storytelling sin that it might be, because there is a lot to talk about, but for the pirates, for some time, they didn't have much going on. Now that they were gathered at the Bab-al-Mandab Strait, the Gate of Tears, under Admiral Henry Every, well, really all they had to do was to wait for their prey to come to them and to spring the trap shut. But they had a problem there. Last time we mentioned that the Islamic calendar was a lunar calendar, and that the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, moved a couple of weeks forward every year. The pirates here at the Gate of Tears may or may not have been aware of that fact. None of them were intimately familiar with the Muslim calendar. I suspect that some of them were kind of cognizant that the months did shift. Maybe Thomas too, probably Henry Every, and maybe they took it into consideration, but most of the pirates there at the Gate of Tears were kind of, befuddled by the whole thing. And none of them, even had they grown up in Mecca, would have known when the ships bound for Mocha on their way to Mecca would be passing through the Gate of Tears. That is to say that they didn't even know if those ships had passed by already or if they were still on their way to the Gate of Tears. Again, I think Henry Every was pretty sure, but the rest of the fleet just kind of had to trust him on that. So they waited. They kept one eye turned south to the Gulf of Aden, in case the Mughal fleet was still on its way to meet them, and they kept the other eye turned north up the Red Sea in case it was coming back to meet them. One way or another, here in an isolated cove on Param Island, they would be there to catch the Mughal fleet when it arrived. And they waited. Days passed, and then a couple of weeks, and still there was no sign of the Mughal fleet. The men on board the ships began to get a bit nervous. They had plenty of food and water and probably some drinks, so that wasn't an issue, so they just kind of spent their days sharpening their swords and oiling their guns and waiting. While they do so, let's turn our eyes elsewhere for a bit. I did have kind of an ulterior motive in bringing up those birds earlier. It's the turkey bird. It came from Madagascar to Turkey, but it did so most often aboard Mughal ships. Sometimes just regular trading ships, but mostly it was these grand Mughal fleets owned by the royal family of the empire. Every year they would sail from India toward the Red Sea, and often they would stop on Madagascar. For the same reason the pirates did: wood and water, maybe some food, and, if they were lucky, some exotic birds to trade once they reached Arabia. But they hadn't done so in a couple of years, and they certainly weren't doing so in 1695. The threat of pirates in the region was just too high. Now, they may not have known about St. Mary's Island, or Adam Baldridge, or, down to the south, St. Augustine Bay, and they certainly did not know about the fleet of English pirates currently waiting for them at the Gate of Tears. But they were aware that European pirates in the region were a growing problem. But more than the English, they were worried, ironically, about the French. Remember, the English pirates at Bob's Key had picked up 2 separate French pirate fleets in the past several weeks. Most of that French piracy was out of Reunion Island, to the southeast of Madagascar. It was a French outpost for any ships that might be sailing to the East Indies, but it was a harbor for many a French buccaneer. And we do need to talk a bit about geopolitics in 1695. The Mughal Empire was in no way involved in the 9 Years' War. They were just a couple of years removed from a war with England and the East India Company, but they were not at war in 1695. Their very close friends, the Ottoman Empire, were not officially involved in the 9 Years' War either. They were, however, involved in what they call the Great Turkish War. That was a war between the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire. This Great Turkish War had been going on since the early 1680s. You may recall that army of Transylvanian and Mongol soldiers that marched on Vienna. You may also recall that King Louis XIV of France used this to his advantage. While the Ottomans were attacking Vienna, he launched the War of the Reunions on the Western Front of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a move that made everyone who was not French angry at King Louis XIV. It's probably the primary factor in there being a grand alliance between the Netherlands, England, and the Holy Roman Empire to stop King Louis XIV from doing this kind of thing ever again. But while England and the Netherlands were allied to the Holy Roman Empire in the League of Augsburg, that was only for the 9 Years' War against France. They were not allied in the war against the Ottomans. That was Emperor Leopold I's concern. William III didn't want anything to do with it. That means, of course, that Vienna was involved in 2 wars at once, one on the Eastern Front and one on the Western Front. And again, officially, France was not involved in any way in the Great Turkish War. But you may remember that the Franco-Ottoman alliance goes back to the early 1500s when Barbarossa initiated contact between France and the Ottoman Empire by wintering near Toulon. Did you manage to follow all of that? I hope so, because you need to also remember that the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire were very close allies. Persia, really Safavid Iran, sat right in the middle of the two empires. The sectarian divide in the Muslim world ensured that Turkey and India would stay close in their opposition to Iran. But despite their close alliance status, Mughal India was not involved in the Great Turkish War. They could be. It really wouldn't be too far out of their way to send money and ships and guns and food and men to Istanbul, which would then be funneled into the war against Vienna. Naturally, this would lead to the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire and the Allied war effort against Louis XIV. That could happen, but it was not happening. And thanks to all of the complex alliances and treaties that had been signed by these international empires, it was unlikely to happen. There was this balance critical to preserving the League of Augsburg and holding Louis XIV back. But for the moment it was holding steady. That's what makes it odd to me that these French pirates were threatening Mughal shipping. They weren't exactly allied with the Mughal Empire in any way whatsoever, but they were allied with the Mughal Empire's close allies. Friends of friends should probably not be prey. Still, though, that's not the worst possibility. The worst possibility, and this is just a pure hypothetical situation, I'm not saying that anything like this could or would happen, but if, hypothetically, an English pirate fleet were to attack a Mughal fleet, the Mughal Empire might just decide it was in their interest to join the war against Vienna and, therefore, the war against England. But of course that's not going to happen, right? On that note, what were the pirates up to there at Bob's Key? Well, isn't that just nice? But maybe it really wasn't going to happen. The pirates were still just kind of waiting there. And things on board the various ships in the fleet were starting to get pretty tense. After their first couple of weeks waiting, everybody correctly assumed that they had missed the Mughal fleet on their way to Mecca. But when those weeks dragged on into a month, some of the men began to worry that they'd in fact missed the fleet on their way from Mecca. That maybe the fleet of the Grand Mughal was already safe and sound back in India. And this was a legitimate concern, something that was kind of eating away at the men's confidence. But as more and more time began to pass, the pirates had another and perhaps more pressing concern on their minds. E.T. Fox writes in King of the Pirates, quote, "Minor repairs and maintenance were probably carried out to the rigging, sails, and decks of the pirate vessels, ensuring they were in the best of shape. But everyday idling in the water meant more and more weed and barnacles accumulating on the hulls beneath the waterline. The pirates could not afford to careen their vessels. They must be ready for a chase when the Pilgrim fleet appeared. Every day the ships got a little slower, imperceptibly at first, but over 6 or 7 weeks probably quite significantly, as later events bear out. Each day the stock of food and drink got a little smaller as 400 men ate their rations." Now, I'm going to put some words in your mouth. I don't know what any of you are thinking, but I'm going to take a guess. I've been talking about this piracy, this big act of piracy for some time now, and you are here for it, waiting for the big act of piracy. And instead you've got barnacles. You've got some jerk talking to you about the alliance between the Ottoman Empire and France? I mean, what's that about? You've been waiting to hear about this piracy for probably about a month now. But listen, you've got to trust me here. This alliance between France and the Ottoman Empire is really important. I know it may not be the most exciting thing, but while we wait, I mean, it's something we need to consider here, right? And I doubt any of you are angry about it, but some of you are probably a little bit annoyed. And I get that, I do. But while you're sitting here listening to this at work or at home or in your car, imagine that you're sitting on the deck of a ship, baking in the hot Arabian sun, and you've been promised this big act of piracy, and yet instead what you've got are barnacles. You've got this jerk telling you that really right now what you need to focus on is the alliance between the Ottoman Empire and the French, because trust me guys, it's really important, right? And it is actually important, and Henry Every knew that it was important. But the men on board the fleet of which he was admiral were starting to get not exactly angry, but a little bit annoyed. There wasn't a threat of, a mutiny, but there was a threat that the fleet was going to break up and sail away. All the captains, but especially Thomas Tew and Henry Every, spent a good deal of their time going from ship to ship, telling everybody that everything was under control. They had nothing to worry about. The ships had absolutely not sailed back down from Mecca while they weren't looking. And usually this did the job, but as the weeks dragged on, their words became less and less convincing. And every once in a while, one of these ships in the fleet would go off to scout, either up the Red Sea or out to the Gulf of Aden, but there was always a worry that they might not come back, and if they didn't, who's to say that it wouldn't create a domino effect? Happily they did always come back, but less happily, they never saw anything useful. And then another worry began to weigh on the minds of the men. Maybe they'd been spotted. Maybe word of their presence had spread. Maybe the Grand Mughal fleet up the Red Sea was waiting while yet another fleet sailed up the Gulf of Aden to trap them. Maybe they would be caught in the crossfire and every last man and ship in the fleet destroyed. And as the days continued to stretch, that slight possibility grew and grew in the minds of the crewmen. A sentiment began to spread among the pirates that it might be for the best if they got out of there before, doom befell every one of them. But when those sentiments began to reach a critical mass, Henry Every or Thomas Tew would come over and reassure them, to placate them, and to tell them that for just a little while longer they had to sit and wait. And the men, to their credit, they did. They waited while June gave way to July, and then July gave way to August. They waited there at the Gate of Tears until mid-August with no sign of the Mughal fleet. Finally, though, nearing the point of real panic, the pirates decided to ready a pinnace. They loaded her up with a crack team of the very best men they had available, and that pinnace sailed off to the north. In a mere 2 days, though, it returned. One day out, they captured a boat from Mocha just off the coast, and they brought back with them 2 prisoners. Those 2 men told the pirates that the fleet of the Grand Mughal was indeed still at anchor up the Red Sea, but when their small boat set sail, all 25 ships of the Grand Mughal's fleet were preparing to make their way south. The pirates were elated. All of that panic dissipated. They got back to sharpening their sabers and oiling their big guns. They set a constant watch. Every set of eyes on board was facing north, waiting for any sign of sails on the horizon. For a day, and then 2, and then 3 and 4. And you'd think that regardless of how many days passed here, they would stay vigilant. I mean, they had word that the fleet was coming right now. And they tried to stay vigilant, but then came day 5 and then day 6. The men were beginning to get wait, there are sails on the horizon, coming right toward them. But it's just one ship, and not a large ship by the look of it. Still, though, they couldn't let her go. Any ship that had seen the pirates would carry word of them, so they sent out a couple of pirate ships and brought her in. The captain of that smaller coastal merchantman had bad news. His ship had been following the Grand Mughals fleet, and as far as he knew, was still doing so. They'd set sail some days before, and if his calculations were correct, they should have passed through the Gate of Tears sometime in the night. It could be that a watchman fell asleep when the Grand Mughals' fleet of 25 large ganja dhow passed. Maybe someone got drunk and managed to miss them on the watch. But I doubt it. There were a ton of men keeping a lookout. I think that the Grand Mughals' fleet knew that there were probably pirates waiting at the Gate of Tears and took every necessary precaution. They doused their lanterns. They sailed wide of any known coves where an ambush could be waiting, and they sailed quiet on the deck. Pretty impressive for a fleet of 25 large ships, but the pirates didn't have any time to be impressed. They had a fleet to catch. They weren't going to let this deter them, not after waiting for as long as they had. So Every and Thomas too and all of the other captains got their men in motion to get underway as fast as possible. After all, their fortune was currently getting away from them. On the 1st of September, 1695, the fleet of pirates under Henry Every and Thomas II, Joseph Farrow, Richard Want, and all the rest made their way out into the Gulf of Aden, pursuing the Grand Mughals' fleet. And that's where we're going to leave it today. I know, it's terrible. But what's coming is too big for the end of an episode. It's too big for one episode. Next time, the Gunsway. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, all of you who have left us ratings or reviews, and everyone who has recommended this show. You all make it possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.